So thank you very much for coming. This is the first time I've spoken to the BCS, and I haven't been a member. This is a little bit like going to confession. I think I've been a member for about 20 years, which is saying a lot. I think I did that thing where there was some kudos attached to it, and I wanted it against my name. So it has been a really interesting journey getting here. As Brian said, I think Brian was introduced to me by the team at Computing, what used to be Computing Magazine, when we used to have magazines. And I'd just written this article, which was really out of curiosity for myself, because I'm a lifelong CTO. So my background, I've effectively been in a CTO role for about 30 years. You may have come across the job site read.co.uk. That was my baby about 30 years ago. So I created that. And then since then, I've been in a number of CTO roles, CTO consultancy roles, including companies like the Financial Times. So I've worked with the Financial Times for some time, but also with a lot of startups and a lot of venture-backed businesses. So I've been inside businesses of all different sizes, and this problem is very different depending on the size of the business that you're in. If you're in a business with thousands of people, this is an entirely different class of problem than it is if you're in a business with 5 people. So I wanted to scratch an itch, and this was just as the theory of tariffs coming out of the US administration was starting to rear its head. We didn't really believe that they would happen. And obviously, the job of a CTO is not academic at all. It's not theoretical at all. It's entirely pragmatic. So our job is to try and figure out where are the risks going to come from and how might we respond. So that could be what happens if a plane lands on my data center, or it could be what happens if it becomes very expensive to buy US technology, which was the threat that I was writing for at the time. However, the US administration has made this talk much easier to write because the move to America first as a political ideology has meant that we've seen a massive change and a massive ramp up. And I said to Brian earlier when I was talking about this, none of the conclusions have really changed, but the urgency of what we're talking about absolutely has. And I think probably this is actually summed up best by Francesca Bria, who is a professor at UCL, who said Europe cannot afford to remain a digital tenant in systems it doesn't control. And that's definitely the situation that we're in. And as I was doing the research, these were things where I had been entirely comfortable for the entirety of my career to go, it's fine, it's American. Right, I can use that. It's Microsoft, it's Google, it's Amazon. That's perfectly fine. It's probably safer there than if I do it myself. And now all of that is coming back to bite everybody that made decisions like I did. And so what we're going to do today, there's a few caveats that I need to give you. I am absolutely not an expert in geopolitics, or indeed the manufacturer of chips or any of those things. I am somebody that buys software for companies. I manage budgets, I manage people. I have to do change for those companies. I have to figure out sometimes how to move people from Microsoft to Google, sometimes from Google to Microsoft, and now there's a new spectre that is appearing. So the fundamental problem that we're talking about, this slide is really all that we're going to talk about for the next 40 or so minutes. There is an incredible reliance across all of the different threads of technology that any business uses. And I'm going to talk about where the software comes from, who uses it, and what types of technology that we're using. Every company that I have worked with, this may or may not be true for you as well. If you work primarily in the UK or in Northern Europe, it's going to be mostly true for you, as we'll actually see later, because we'll break down a little bit country by country, but we are entirely dependent on American technology. Some of us have managed to move away a little bit by adopting open source technology, but under the hood of almost everything we do, you can trace your link back to US tech. This research was done by a company that has some skin in the game. So this is Proton. Proton became quite famous being a Swiss sovereign email application, sort of collaboration email application. It's a little bit like Google Docs, not quite as full featured. Have a VPN as well, and it's become a little bit the default choice for anybody that doesn't want to use Google for their personal email or Apple for their personal email, and want something with a broadly equivalent user experience. But their research shows that 90% of Europe's technology infrastructure is US controlled. And we'll get into a little bit what we mean by US controlled in a little while. 74% of listed European companies rely on US email providers. So that is really either going to be Google or Microsoft. But that number is 88% in the UK and 100% in Ireland in some particular sectors. There's also, I think the top 200 privately owned businesses in the UK are entirely dependent on Microsoft or Google, their email. So even with the size of the UK market, we are entirely dependent. Every email we send, which for a lot of businesses is the entirety of their technology. I've worked in a lot of businesses where their technology is Outlook, Excel, and PowerPoint. That's it. They don't really use anything else. There might somewhere be a finance system or an HR system, but they run entire businesses on those three bits of technology. So why now? Well, I mean, I think it's obvious why now, but just to restate the obvious, we're seeing tariffs as leverage. We certainly haven't seen that in, not necessarily living memory, but certainly recent memory. We haven't seen tariffs being used as a weapon like this. Even if we go back to Ronald Reagan, saw that tariffs were a brilliant instrument. We are being told by the American administration that they will enforce a digital kill switch. So if we don't toe the line, if we don't pay our tariffs, if we aren't nice to them about invading Greenland, then they will cut off our access to American providers. And it's a little bit more nefarious. It's never going to be quite that cut and dry. And the US administration is not known for staying in course on the things that it said either. So there's a lot of stick waving, and we have to be very cautious with how we interpret that threat. The NATO tensions have been writ large recently. I think it has taken the foundations of our belief that we have a good neighbor, a good and reliable neighbor. Obviously, the rhetoric is coming the other way and saying we're not reliable, but I think we certainly feel it the other way. America First is really at the heart of this, the closing of borders from what was an incredibly open environment. And that openness led to its success. I mean, there's no bones about it. It's the fact that it was one of the easiest environments to trade in, so that everybody actually went to the US to do business, has led to it becoming the superpower that it is. So, am I overstating this threat? Well, yes. I mean, it's, and I hope I will give you a balanced view of it. But if you were to ask yourself, could this really happen? Could America really do the things that it's threatening? Because members of the US administration model themselves on strongmen around the world, we can look at other countries that they look at and admire and see that behavior. Recently, actually, this has been something that I have spoken about in some of my talks for about 5 years. This has been about 5 years in the making. But as of March of this year, Roskomnadzor, which is the agency responsible for information in Russia, digital information in Russia, has taken control of RUNET, the Russian internet. It can now turn off the Russian internet completely, cutting it off from the West, and it can also guide traffic and allow traffic only to sites that it wants to. So it can be very selective about what traffic, if any, is allowed out of Russia. So if Russia, obviously we don't rely on it for any services, certainly not in knowing ways, wanted to cut us off, it could. So in theory, could the US do the same thing? It's technically possible, highly unlikely, many years of work to do it, but they could do it. We're also starting to see these issues with, I mean, I did and ah about whether this really fit the nature of what we wanted to talk about this evening, because this is a little bit like vendor centricity, it's a little bit like center of gravity around particular vendors. But I think that this is important because of the way that it was interpreted. This Storm 558 hack was a China-located individual, which the popular belief is that it is state-sponsored information espionage. Chinese threat actor breached Microsoft servers and gained access to a Microsoft sign-in key. Now, unlike a normal hack of some part of the Microsoft ecosystem, what that meant is that they could impersonate anyone that they wanted to. But because they had the sign-in key, they could take or at least impersonate anyone's credentials, which meant that for all of the government agencies across Europe that use Microsoft as an identity provider were effectively giving up all of their secrets to that individual. So this was a Microsoft breach, but because everybody channels everything and everything is dependent on Microsoft, it meant that one single breach allowed access to governments around Europe, because they are effectively deciding if that individual has access to state secrets, Microsoft is going to give them access to state secrets if they're in Microsoft 365, which is called a radical. That one incident was one of the things, even though it's really about the supply chain management density. There's one of the bigger things was suddenly that was a catalyst for governments around Europe, federal and national governments around Europe to take a hard look at how exposed they were to this supply chain. We're going to talk a little bit more about two US acts, which have been around for some time before the current US administration, but we didn't get quite so nervous about it before then. One of those is the Cloud Act. I'm going to talk about the Cloud Act and FISA in a second. But under the Cloud Act, in France, under testimony to the French Senate, members of Microsoft's executive team in France admitted that if asked by the US government, they would have to give up any of the information that was stored on Microsoft servers in Paris, not Microsoft servers in the US. And that actually is an extension. You may have heard of Schrems 2, which is a big privacy act. There was a very big court case that was between Microsoft and the US government, where the US government demanded access to email records that Microsoft held for a foreign company. And that effectively set a precedent where the US government said, no, you have to give it to us regardless of which territory it's held in. So I said I'd talk about these two acts. These are fundamental to why Europe and sort of an extended, not just Europe itself, but a number of, as Mark Carney called it, mid-sized countries around the world are getting nervous about this dependence. The Cloud Act is one of these. We're going to talk about Cloud Act and FISA. They're very similar, but have different uses. The Cloud Act is the reason that we got so nervous about the French Senate's information. So the two of the things that are important to know about the Cloud Act is that it says that any company that is subject to US jurisdiction must hand over data to US law enforcement. That effectively means if you have an office in the US. So Microsoft obviously has an office in the US, but any company that has an office in the US can be compelled by US law enforcement to hand over any information they have, regardless of territory. And that leads to this Frankfurt or Paris paradox problem, which is even if you are the French government and you use AWS, you wouldn't do it now, but the French government and you use AWS in Paris, hosting in Paris, you can be compelled, well, AWS, Amazon in that case, can be compelled to give up your information under a, they have to have a court order to release that information. That's one of the things about the Cloud Act. The Cloud Act is specifically about law enforcement, but the FISA, this FISA Section 702, the expanded version of it, is not about law enforcement. It's about spying. So the fundamental difference between these two things is that under the Cloud Act, a specific individual needs a court order to have their information released. Under FISA, none of those things really happen because this is nation-state espionage. And what effectively can happen is the intelligence organizations in the US can effectively request a class of surveillance without targeting anyone in particular and demand that that information is released with the same extraterritorial rights that they claimed before. So these two are very strongly related, but one is about law enforcement and one is about espionage. The difference between the two, the purpose, as I just said, 702 is spying, Cloud Act is law enforcement. The standard for retrieving information, the Section 702 is no warrant, it's your program. If this is a class of request that we want, then you have to give it to us, but probable cause and a warrant is required for the Cloud Act. The target for Section 702 is foreigners abroad, so specifically not US citizens. Cloud Act is anyone if there is a crime. So it's specifically related to law enforcement, and secrecy is extremely classified. With the Cloud Act, it's often gagged, but that can be changed. So it's not considered an official secret. There is a fundamental problem here between EU law. I'm very aware that for unfortunate reasons, we're no longer really part of the EU, but the different we do follow the same GDPR regulations broadly, and there is a fundamental mismatch between what the US law says and what UK law says. Fundamentally, in the EU, we say protect the data, whereas the USA hand over the data. In the EU, they say inform data subjects of any requests. In the US, you cannot tell the customer. In the EU, data residency matters. If you're in London, that's different from being in Frankfurt. In US law, doesn't matter where it is. If you are an American company, you are subject to this law, or you are subject to US jurisdiction, even more broadly. So GDPR Article 48 says you cannot hand over EU citizens' data to foreign authority unless there is an international treaty in place. Both of those US acts say you have to. So you can suddenly start seeing why everybody gets so nervous, why all the large businesses and governments are getting so nervous about these things, because the two laws are completely technical and compatible with each other. To the point that Meta was fined, I think it was on that previous slide, Meta was fined 1.2 billion. And it's really a test of who has the bigger stick. Meta, in this case, were willing to pay the EU 1.2 billion because the threat, the penalty in the US would have been larger. You can understand that. They are going to break one of these laws. They're going to choose which one to break, depending on which one hurts more. So where are we talking about? Again, I spoke to Brian about this. When I did my research originally, I was a little bit looser in the definition of what I meant by non-US, but I really, for this talk in particular, I wanted to tighten that up and think, if I'm saying non-US, what do I really mean? Do I mean the UK and the EU? Do I mean UK, Switzerland in the EU? Do I include the Scandinavian countries because they've got some good software? So what exactly am I talking about? How do I just do the whole world? Does that include China? Does it include Russia? Does it include Belarus? So I thought, well, we'll start easy, UK and Europe. So if we take the UK and Europe, they're broadly comparable areas, or at least they feel broadly comparable. They sort of are, except they're not. The population of UK, Europe, and Switzerland is about 745 million people. The population, I think that actually includes a lot of contiguous Europe. Again, we're not talking EU, we're talking Europe, so where do you draw boundaries? If you talk about the US, that's 348 million, so about half as many people, but they have almost the same GDP. So yeah, you could squint and say, well, the GDP is the same, so if we're talking about businesses, that's fine, but you can't really do that because it's really easy to sell things in the US because although there are federal laws and state laws, the difference in entering the US, it's very, very easy to set up a company in the US. It's a monoculture broadly. It has a single language. Actually, until last year, it didn't have any official languages. It's only recently had its official language agreed. Whereas in Europe, or this extended group of countries, there's at least 20, if not more, national jurisdictions, each with different levels of self-government. There's the Court of Justice, and there's many languages, more than 27 languages, and it's definitely not a monoculture. Each of these has very, very different expectations of their culture, their citizens, and their software. So I came up with an idea. Well, if I'm going to talk about a much more specific area, then let's talk about Eurovision Plus. That's my definition of the area that we're talking about, because I needed something that I could really point to. So what I've decided is the area that we're largely going to talk about today, the area that it would be easy to sell into, is all of the people that compete in Eurovision, plus Canada and New Zealand, because that gives me access to lots of really good companies that are in those particular countries. The color coding is a little bit off here, but we're broadly talking about these countries. We're not talking about Belarus. I'm sort of excluding China at the moment. We'll see that gets a little bit tricky. And I am excluding from this, I think I'm including Belarus as well. So one country, 340 million people, $31 trillion of GDP. Or 42 countries, 661 million people, however many languages in there. And I'm pretty sure that Yorkshire is a separate language as well, but there's a lot of difference here. So if you're looking at this and thinking, well, where am I going to launch my business? I need to make a business. I need to get it into the market. I need to test where I'm going to sell it to. This looks an awful lot more compelling than this does. This is hard, this is relatively more easy. And I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why it is much more easy, not just these reasons, but there are lots of other reasons why great software tends to come from the US and why that's such a problem for us, especially under the shadow of the threats that we've been talking about. So let's just confirm exactly what tech we're talking about, because it could be anything. I mean, it could be calculators and till. It's not. I've kind of cut this down the middle, and I'm really going to talk about the two things, especially the CTO, that I see. There are really two big bits of tech in my world, if I'm responsible for technology in the business. One is what I would call business technology, and the other is what I would sort of call infrastructure engineering or product technology, product-related technology. If I'm building something of my own, then I need the things over here on the left. For all of the people that work in my business, I need the things on the right. And interestingly, if you're a startup, this is the stuff that gets all the attention. The infrastructure engineering is where all of the cool people want to work. This over here, the business tech, is kind of the boring stuff that carries less interest for a lot of those whiz-kid startup people. But the bills are often larger, especially as you get into bigger businesses. And if they don't work, you really hear about it. This is where all your help desk people work. So I care deeply about this. This just gets much more attention. That's the type of technology that we're looking at. And effectively, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down. And I've been out and had a look and tried to find in each of these areas, by these categories, are there specific areas where I can find good alternatives to the US technology? The US tech is on the left, and the non-US tech, our Eurovision Plus contestants, a little bit broader than that because I broke my own rules, are on the right. So workspace tools are really interesting. If you're a big business, you are almost certain, I think it's something like 90% of the S&P 500 use Office 365. Absolutely dominant. And if I go into any more traditional business, they will absolutely use Microsoft. You go into any startup, they're going to use Google Workspace. I will almost refuse to use anything except Google Workspace. I cannot live with 365 anymore. But yeah, there we go. So I unfortunately have to. And what you're going to find is that in startup world, there's also an entire class of software which you may or may not have come across, which these startup founders in the early teams will refuse to work without. So things like Notion, every startup that I've ever come across uses Notion now. Their knowledge management inside their businesses sits in here. It doesn't sit in folders in Microsoft world, it sits in Pages in Notion. So there are classes of things like this. But this area, in some ways, is reasonably well matched on the non-US side, but only sort of around the edges. Atlassian, an Australian company, does a really fantastic job of producing things like IT service desk technology. Their sort of wikis and knowledge management pretty good. A lot of their engineer tooling is amongst the best in class. Proton Mail is a very, very good equivalent for something like Google Workspace, but it misses really critical parts of that stack. There is really no good alternative in any of these products to Excel. PowerPoint lives in a slightly weird world, and I'm very conscious that there are businesses where they exist on Outlook and Excel and PowerPoint, and those are the three things that they use every single day. All of their data for the whole business is transmitted by Excel, person to person, by Outlook. That's it. That's the entire tech stack. None of this solves that problem. There are some interesting businesses that use LibreOffice. LibreOffice is an open source product, which is pretty good. I actually tried making this deck on it. I said to Brian, I wanted to live up to this. Can I build this deck on non-US tech? I went back to Google Sheets after spending 5 minutes trying to bold a piece of text. LibreOffice is pretty good, but I have been in the position of moving people from Microsoft to Google or Google to Microsoft, and these are the best products on the market, and it takes a long time. And I cannot wrestle Excel away from finance people, no matter what I do. I've used tasers, I've used all kinds of things. I cannot stop them. I literally cannot get them to stop using it, and that's moving it to the best possible equivalent, which is Google Workspace. So Collabora is really interesting. It's a British company that provides a shell over LibreOffice. Looks quite promising, and that is actually starting to form the basis of some nation states. So they're actually starting to use this as their alternative, and we'll talk about France and Germany in a moment. OnlyOffice, it's got a real warning sign there. Actually, Latvian company. theoretically, but there's been some concern about it because apparently it has links to a Russian company that has some links that give people cause for concern about how this might be used. So only if this actually looked pretty good as an alternative. And then I found this is kind of the threads that you're pulling. As I'm going, okay, what could I use instead of that? And so really only LibreOffice, which isn't online. It doesn't have that fully online capability. Your files aren't in the cloud. That's kind of what Collaborate can do. So this is actually a really big problem. Even though there are some good elements, it is actually quite difficult. There are, however, some real bright spots, and Europe is doing a lot of things well. I mean, I think everybody in the room will know Sage, one of our oldie and goldie British IT software companies, primarily from a finance and accounting background, but still chosen by companies worldwide. If you've got these absolute monsters in the US, HubSpot, Salesforce, Adobe has moved much more away from their roots in design software and into this world of CRM and account management. Really well represented on the SME side. So it's, again, as I said, it's slightly different on the enterprise layer where you'd be using Sage and SOP, but Xero is an absolutely fantastic best in breed above almost everything else, finance product for SMEs. So it won't scale to the same level as Sage will, but almost every startup is going to be using Xero. Almost every startup, certainly in Europe, and it's a Kiwi product from New Zealand. Shopify, huge success story from Canada. So if you want to set up a shop online, there is almost no better alternative to Shopify. So if you go and look at the US-owned ones, there's potentially Stripe and some other competitors that do payments. And I'll come back to Stripe in a minute. And we have our own payments providers. Europe has always been good at banking, and so we've got a strong fintech layer through everything that we do. I pulled out WorldPay and Stripe here, and this is the first of a few hints that it's really worth paying attention to. WorldPay, I was thinking, okay, well, WorldPay, that was European business. I've used that before in payments business. If I need somebody paying a credit card, I'll choose WorldPay. Now, there are definitely US equivalents to WorldPay, which are very good. But I was thinking, that's safe. I'll go to WorldPay. January 26th, it was sold to Thoma Bravo, I think, private equity business. Stripe, I'm going to call this that. It was a slightly different journey. It was never a European business. But the two Irish brothers that set Stripe up had previously set up startups in Ireland, gone to Harvard and MIT, dropped out, gone to Silicon Valley, and set Stripe up. And there's an important thing that I will come back to there, because we had the talent, we had the people, but the ecosystem was in the US. That's why they moved. They went there. And everything that was showered upon them made it much more likely that they would create a successful software product. In cloud, it's a really interesting story globally across all cloud hosting. These three, AWS, Azure, and GCP, have nearly 2/3 of the entire market. So they're absolutely dominant. And of those, AWS is by far the largest. It's one of those things that's a little bit like in the old days, you would choose IBM, and now you just choose AWS. That is the sensible choice. Whether you're a big business or you're a startup, you choose AWS. So just what you do. The situation for European, UK and European providers is not quite as rosy as it could be, but actually isn't as bad as I feared it was. I thought it was actually going to be much more dire than it was. I had the good fortune of working with a French business, so I know OVH Cloud quite well. They are probably the best competitor, non-US competitor, to these businesses. It's a very, well, actually, I say that. There is also Ali Cloud, which is very good, but it's Chinese. So Ali Cloud has a lot of the features of AWS, but OVH Cloud is a very, very good European competitor. Vivo is a British business. I think it's slightly related to what was UK Cloud a few years ago. It has a very good team, and it has a pretty reasonable set of services that are available to it. You can set up Kubernetes clusters, and you can rent GPUs. The problem with this, and we will talk about that a little bit more, the problem with this is the reason that people go to AWS isn't because they can rent things cheap. It's all of the other things that AWS has built around it. So people go to AWS because of S3, where you can store your files. They go to it because of all the cloud security or the FinOps, the financial operations tools that they've added, or how easy it is to spin up a Lambda function on AWS. These things, because AWS has the most money, can plow the most into improving its service. So it gets very sticky because of the features. Whereas most of the clouds in Europe are stuck a little bit closer to the tin. They don't have all of the fun things. And so developers who press for the decisions to be made, people like me, you have to use Amazon, you have to use Amazon. And the truth of the matter is, if you use AWS, your bills will be lower. It will cost you less to staff your team if you choose AWS because there are more AWS trained engineers on the market. And they're the most expensive thing you're going to spend your money on. If you go with GCP, there's fundamentally fewer people. Sovereignty, another interesting lesson here. So as I was looking for what might be considered European sovereign clouds, Sovereignty was a Dutch sovereign cloud. And a lot of Dutch government and the municipality of Amsterdam had chosen to use Sovereignty because it was a Dutch sovereign cloud. Unfortunately, it got sold to a US business, at which point Amsterdam described it as disappointing to find out that their servers were now going to be under the auspices of the Cloud Act and the Fees Act, because that's now an American business. So even though it was previously Dutch, this transaction meant that it wasn't anymore. That's a fundamental risk to everything that we're talking about. On AI, this is the big news now because all those other things that I've shown you, AI is just going to replace them. That's at least the news last week. So it is obvious at the moment that there is a lot of what looks like circular financing going on in the US, which is applying money into the S&P 500, and it's propping up these businesses, but it does mean they've got all the chips, and if they've got all the chips, they can do all the processing. So most of the stuff that we hear about is American AI. However, and again, I said I'm not really going to talk about China, but I have to with AI because models like Qwen, which is Alibaba's LLM, is extremely good, as is the research that's coming out of DeepSeek. You may have heard of DeepSeek R5 last year. That's a big deal. They are moving very, very quickly. And the Chinese state is supporting that because it sees the strategic importance of it. We're not going to talk about China. It's not on my Eurovision Plus list. But we do have a reasonable set in Eurovision Plus of alternatives. The biggest of those is French. It's Mistral, which you may have heard of. That's probably the one that is most within the reach of us, the most familiar to us. You could probably switch reasonably easily from ChatGPT to Mistral. It has a lot of the same features, and that's the team in Paris building it. So here is Canadian, and it's very specifically built to support public sector workloads. That's really what it's for, high governance workloads. And it's not American. So by virtue of letting Canada compete in Eurovision, we can claim that we can use Cohere as well. Even this evening, we've already had a fight with two of these, so trying to get Teams turned off and Zoom turned on. Almost every company in the world is going to use one of these. It still infuriates me, disappoints me how many companies I found out their executive teams almost exclusively talk on WhatsApp, not a business tool, regardless of what they tell you. And obviously every startup in the world uses Slack. That is going to be 99% of businesses using one of these to communicate. Probably 0.5% using Google Meet. There are some decent competitors, they're just not being used. So in that non-US group of countries, there are actually a number of really good businesses. Element is based on the Matrix protocol, which is also the same protocol that is used in Visio, which you probably have heard recently the French government is moving to. We'll talk about that in a second. That's an open protocol, and I think that starts to show us the way that we are going to be able to compete, looking at how we can embrace open protocols. There's Visio here. That's the product that I was just talking about. That is part of a French government, French and to an extent German government collaboration. And Visio is the product that is also built on the Matrix protocol. Prima is, again, a really interesting looking product that does most of the things that Slack does, built out in Switzerland. One thing we do really well, and we have to be to take the good where we can, is security. So we do actually have a really strong security heritage across Europe, and slightly in that wider Eurovision Plus, and I'm being a little bit cheeky here, but although it's not necessarily true of the enterprise grade products, things like Oxfordshire, CloudStrike, and Jamf, and Palo Alto, those are all American. But in the SME market, if you're up to about 200 people, these regularly are name checked and reviewed as being the best products in the market for small businesses. Bitdefender regularly wins the best antivirus or endpoint protection and response. NordVPN, the best VPN. 1Password, the best password manager. Sophos is a Cambridge-based antivirus or EDR provider. And Riot, which is a French company, does some of the best security training that I've ever seen. So you don't have to, for all of these things, there are really good, credible alternatives to the US. They called out Darktrace because I was like, oh yeah, Darktrace, that's British. No, it's not Darktrace. It's actually Darktrace that was bought by Thoma Bravo. That was very recently. Mirador, which was a Finnish business, was bought again very recently, I think in the last 6 months, by GoTo, who used to make GoToMeeting, you probably remember that company from years and years ago when you used to remote desktop. But Mirador was a great sort of wider European Scandinavian business and has recently moved. The problem for us is less about software. We know it's Excel, but it's also about software. It's also not just about software. The problem is hardware. There is almost nothing that we can do about the supply, not the design, but the supply of silicon into the devices that we use. So every business is dependent now on laptops and phones. Those laptops and phones have to be manufactured. And actually, I kind of kicked myself because on devices, I was being very hard. There are a number of devices. Yes, we don't have Sony Bios or Fujitsu laptops anymore, but we do have Samsung, which is obviously Korea. We do have, we do have Fujitsu, we don't have Toshiba. We have Lenovo, there's a number in the audience that I've already seen. Fairphone is a Dutch company that makes phones, and we actually have Nothing, which is a very trendy phone company that's based in London, does all of its manufacturing in China. So again, you have to be very conscious about where you draw the line. Is it where is the HQ or where the majority of the funding is coming from or where the majority of the work is doing? Very, very difficult to understand. But the problem is those chips. There really aren't good alternatives to Intel or AMD chips, processors, CPUs, or really NVIDIA chips for training large language models. China is trying very hard to wean itself off US dependence, but you've probably seen the arguments that are happening about whether the US administration is going to allow them to be supplied to China or not. It's because they are so important, so critical. Even AMD, that used to fight tooth and claw with NVIDIA years ago when it was just GPU, isn't really able to compete at the moment. There are fortunately some reasonable sort of European competitors and I would actually like to go under the hood of that a little bit more, but we can find some what at least looks like still being European businesses that can compete with the big US networking providers. And that's the backbone of the internet and the backbone of our core network. So those are important as well. So that's kind of all the different things. And if you like that, and there's more, like that's just a selection of the biggest things that we're worrying as a CTO. What do I have to replace if I'm going to replace all those things? And I keep coming back to the fact that Excel is going to be the hardest thing that I have to fight against. I can probably give people Ubuntu, I can probably buy them Samsung laptops, and I can probably force them to use something that isn't Slack or Teams to talk on. But I am going to have a real problem when I get to try and take Excel away from people. There really is yet no good alternative to that. And so a proper European equivalent to Google Workspace and Microsoft 365 is probably the most important thing that we can actually focus on. Our top priority in Europe should be themselves. I did also break this down. One of the things that I do when I'm looking at my budgets as a CTO is I'm trying to figure out how much am I spending for every person I have in the business. This is the business technology, not the fancy tech. Not what I'm going to be building my cloudy things on, but if I'm going to give people communication tools and cybersecurity training and all of those different things and HR systems, what does this look like? Broadly, if I do some the non-US stacks, that's right in the middle of what a pure Google environment and a Microsoft stack will look like, that will wax and wane depending on the things that you're actually buying, but really the price isn't the problem here. So we can look at this and say, yes, we can broadly fill in all of these blanks if we need to, and the price isn't going to be stopping us. I said that I would talk quickly about last week numeric. This is a French government, particularly last week, this is a French government project, which is aiming to replace everything that Microsoft has in Microsoft 365 and by Google has in Google Workspace. They're not there yet, but they are deeply committed to using open source technology to deliver that. I mentioned that their Visio product their messaging product is using Matrix, the underlying protocol, and they're doing a lot of the same things like with Docs. I think they're using the open office source, but then putting a wrapper on over the top. There is also a company that I haven't talked about, and this I just felt like this was cheating. When I discovered this when I wrote my original article, it's like, oh yeah, Zoho, they do stuff. And then when I went and looked at Zoho is an Indian, primarily Indian business, but it was registered in Delaware. In fact, it might not even be Delaware, it might be New York. No, it's New Jersey. It was registered in New Jersey in about 2005. They do everything. So depending on how you squint and look at this, you could literally go out and replace every single thing that I've talked about with something that Zoho do. It is wild. And actually the quality is very, very high indeed. So almost all of the engineering happens in India. The founders are Indian. It just so happens they went to the US to start their business. It is amazing just how broad their spread goes. Everything from security tools, remote management, CRMs, HR systems, the whole collaboration tooling for Access, Excel, all those things, they produce them. It just felt too easy. So I couldn't come in here and say, this is what you need to do, just move to Zoho. But that is one answer. If you're comfortable with Zoho as a business, it really is very impressive. So there is an uncomfortable truth with all of this. So I can tell you the tools that you might want to move to. I can tell you that there are alternatives, but you are giving away productivity and efficiency if you choose it. You are costing yourself money. So the really uncomfortable truth for all of us in this room is if you were to choose to do this right now, you will not be as productive or as effective. You will find it harder to attract people to come and work at your business. Your self-retention probably won't be as good. I know people that say they will never work in a Microsoft company again, but if you even take Microsoft away and give them Linux and ask them to become techies in a way that they're not familiar with because the edges haven't been rounded off, you're going to have a massive problem. The familiarity with these tools is for a reason. People are familiar with them, but it's easy for them to use because they are currently the best in the market. And because they're the best in the market, they have the deepest pockets. And we can argue about whether Microsoft is really a perfect product and whether Google has all the things that it needs. But fundamentally, there is nothing that can touch them for the quality of their user experience. As frustrating it is for me to admit that, because I don't particularly like any of the office tools, but they are very good. As somebody that spent 5 minutes trying to bold a piece of text in LibreOffice earlier. There are also some really good open source tools, and I thought, there are some bright spots here. These are actually tools that I have on my computer. Every time I rebuild it, these get put straight back on. These are all open source with different licenses. Penplot is an alternative to the US Figma that was almost bought by Adobe for a massive sum last year. Inkscape is kind of like another Adobe product. Illustrator. Audacity is an excellent sound wave editor. If you record podcasts or anything, Audacity really great job of editing them, just not with AI yet. Bruno is an alternative to Postman, which is absolutely dominant in developer ecosystem. GIMP is effectively Photoshop. And VS Code, even though it's Microsoft, it goes back to the time when Microsoft started open sourcing a huge amount of what they did. Microsoft became a very different company, and it's really interesting. One of the reasons I included it, VS Code is absolutely the dominant IDE that developers will use. Almost every developer used to be highly religious, but now almost everybody has VS Code on their desktop. And one of the reasons is it's open source and extremely extensible. So you could argue, even though that's Microsoft, it's free and open source, and that will potentially change our opinion of those things. So as we come to wrap this up, I did want to talk about why there really aren't any great European competitors. I've given you a selection of different companies that are pretty good along some axes. And you can see the scale of the problem. When you look at the 10 largest companies in the world, 9 of them are US tech businesses, and 1 of them is Saudi Aramco. The amount of money that US tech businesses make, or at least that they are worth, and they are worth speculatively. I've got a whole extra hour-and-a-half long presentation for that one. But the amount of money that these businesses are worth is absolutely phenomenal. And that is a symptom of the ecosystem that they have grown up in. In the S&P 500, so the 500 largest public businesses, publicly listed businesses in the US, top 7, so most of those businesses are on the other slide, so that's Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, those businesses. The top 7 make up more than 33% of the S&P 500. And they are absolutely dominant. We could go back to arguing about how much of that is inflated by AI at the moment, and the answer is an awful lot. But the US market love tech, and they love tech valuations. This doesn't, that's only a glimpse from the very, very top. If you start going down and you look at where private equity money is going and where venture capital money is going, you can actually see that there is a very significant difference between Europe, the whole of Europe, including the UK, and the US. So these graphs, the one at the top left here, that's private equity money. So that's slightly larger businesses. Typically, you'll start with venture capital when you go up to private equity. You go up to private equity, you can see this blue bar here, the very, very large amount, that is private equity money coming from North America. So if you start successful software startups, you get your venture capital funding, you will get bought by a private equity business. The money is in North America. There is a little bit of money in Europe, but it doesn't compete. And this is also true of the amount of exits. You can also see that the number of exits is much more equal here. So you can actually see that roughly, if we look at the pink and the blue, those numbers are Europe and the US. The number of exits is the same, but the valuation doesn't even compete. We can also see where the money is being spent. This is venture capital. So the graph on the left is venture capital spending. These are trends going for VC-backed companies by their sector. So the stack graph, the bright pink part of that is money being spent on software. So what you can see is in the US, the vast majority of venture capital money is going to software. The reason it's so big this year is because they're classifying AI as software. So all of that money that's going to the AI startups that are just piggybacking on something ChatGPT is doing is in this section. So part of this problem is the ecosystem, and the problem for us. We do not have a regulatory ecosystem or, in fact, an investing ecosystem that encourages businesses to start up in Europe and sell to European businesses in the same way that US businesses do. So there is a massive winner takes all, at least winner takes most problem, that if you set up a successful software business and you happen to do that in Europe, you are going to leave and you're going to go to the US. So even if we create them, they're going to leave us and they will end up in the US because Silicon Valley is a much better place to get money. The other thing is the average check size. Just notice this is American check, rather than we copied it and not called it, or it's spelled autocorrect. But the average check size is significantly more. American VCs are just braver. They make bigger bets on riskier businesses because they've got more money and they make more off the back of that. So you're more likely to get funded. They expect you to be talking in bigger numbers. One of the things that I learned early on is if you go to a VC in Silicon Valley, they're expecting you to be talking about $100 million investments and 100x exits. If in London, that's going to be $10 million investments. Same business, same set of founders, but the ecosystem is encouraging much more explosive growth and desire for success in the US, especially on the West Coast, than it is in London. And London is the biggest of all of the European startup locations as well. So this could be put down to the fact that it is much harder to build for Europe. We have to build multilingual. We have to build for multi different regulations in different countries. But Google and Microsoft have to do the same thing. They do have first mover advantage, but even Microsoft didn't invent the spreadsheet. They came along and they just improved it. And in fact, I think they bought Box Pro and then just jacked up the price so that nobody could buy it anymore. So I think there is a grassroots problem, but it's not so much that the very base of the innovation ecosystem isn't working, it's that we lose our founders very, very early. And yes, we could say it's hard to build for Europe and much easier to build for the US. That is definitely true, but not so much that it should stop people starting here. But we have to retain the businesses that we build. There are signs of progress. So we've seen a number of European organizations, but primarily in public administration, that are starting to move. So the International Criminal Court replaced Microsoft with the Open Desk. Schleswig-Holstein recently cancelled 70% of their Microsoft licenses, and I think they've completed that move. the French Ministry of Finance and the France government-wide have started moving. So Ministry of Finance is using this private cloud. France, you may have seen on the news in the last week or so that they are moving to use Visio, which is that product that we were talking about. And the German Sovereign Tech Fund is also saying that it is going to invest significantly more in its own venture ecosystem. And lots more on AI. There is lots of noise about AI. Back in November of last year, there was a big conference. I wasn't invited, I don't know why, but there was a big conference in Berlin, because we're not European anymore, where particularly France and Germany were leading the conversation about what we needed in Europe to sustain competition against the US. And these were 7 of the things that they were talking about: simplifying the regulations, making sure that there were fairer digital markets, so investigating competition much more thoroughly than they were, ensuring that there are safeguards for data sovereignty, developing digital commons, so things like digital identities, making sure that those things can be shared across Europe, making much greater use of open source software in public administration. And obviously, the more people we get using it, the more contributions that you can get and the better it gets. Creating a France and Germany-led digital sovereignty task force and starting to invest in European frontier AI. So these seem like great things. It's a shame that the UK wasn't more present in that conversation, and we should be. Obviously, this group should be leading some of those conversations, but this seems like a pretty good starter for some of the things that we need to do. Sean Berry recently, I think in the last week, has called out, or at least there was a press about this in the last week, that we should have an early day motion about digital sovereignty. The quote from her here is: "Successive UK governments have created huge risks by sleeping on the issue of digital sovereignty while boosting the influence of the biggest US and China-based tech companies." Some of the things that she cites are things like the $400 million contract that the MOD has just signed with Google Cloud. It's apparently sovereign cloud, but we all know now that is, you have to squint as to whether that is any valuable to us. Palantir, a very trendy West Coast tech business, has partnered with, I think, the MOD again, and there is I think we're now at the end and have had the final report from the CMA investigation into Microsoft and AWS cloud governance, which found they are dominant and have abused their permission. So we're starting to see progress in the UK, but we need to go a lot further. And the question then is, what do we really need? Well, we're not going to build a Microsoft killer. We just can't create out of the ecosystem that we have an environment that says to a group of founders in the UK, build an equivalent Google Workspace. But what we might do is build elements of that. And in order to build small elements of that and make them successful, we need high levels of interoperability. It'd be great if they were open source, but even closed source products can be highly interoperable. Using open standards at the very least, like we've seen with the Matrix protocol. And one of the things that I think it is important not to understate is we have to have a better user experience. Because all of those things that I was talking about earlier, why can't we accelerate? It's familiarity. But at the end of the day, we need people to be going out and telling their friends to use a particular tool that has been created in the UK and Europe because it is better, not because it is free or interoperable or open source. And unfortunately, I think we're still in that market where you have to make do with second best, not go out and crow about things being absolutely best that it can be. One thing I was very pleased to discover this on my travels, there is already a site called europeanalternatives.eu. There might be some British ones on there. But if you want to go and look by category, a lot of the companies that I have talked about today will be on there, but you can literally go through and say, what we're doing for European Alternative to something, and you can browse it, and that's already been done. Nothing to do with me, it's just there, and I thought it's very useful. So, what are the key takeaways from that whole thing? The top one, unfortunately, is complicated, and I think you probably get that sense. Like, how do we decide if it's US or not? Is it just it's got an office there? Is it majority owned by a US private equity business? Is it that they own the rights to the thing that they're building? I don't know, and there isn't an easy answer. US tech dependency is a problem. We are only really starting to understand that fully now. It is a massive issue for us because we could lose access. It's not likely, but thinking of the CTO, somebody that has to work out the risks and the probabilities of things happening to our businesses, we could lose access. The good news is there are alternatives in almost every single software category. Sometimes they won't be quite as good. Sometimes they'll be very nearly as good. And in SME cases, often better. Hardware still remains a problem, and particularly silicon. That's definitely the big issue that we have to solve. The cost is comparable, so don't worry about that. Like you'll be spending roughly the same, depending on, even with the open source things, they will still cost you roughly the same amount of money. The barrier for me is definitely change. I don't see this as a technical problem. I do see it as a problem of getting users to switch from one stack to another stack. And that will be made easier when the stack we're switching to becomes best of breed. That's the aim and the hopes that we need to get more. Europe's investment ecosystem is a problem. UK is still the largest investment area in that broader European continent. So we are the healthiest and we are the most like the US. But that doesn't mean that we can compete on a global stage with US investment. And almost every one of those companies where I said it was in that EU stack, it's not. If you consider the amount of investment on it, every single time I was looking at, well, who's invested in it? It was US VC businesses that invested in it. And looking at this and trying to give some advice on what to do, the only thing that I can really tell is start pragmatically. You'll probably be able to go out and look responsibly at the things that you have chosen to use and how you might reverse out of those decisions if you have to. I wouldn't say go and run and rip all those things out and change it, because I think you'll be damaging yourselves as organizations. I don't think it's going to be a pleasant experience switching to a non-US stack, but I think it might be necessary. So you can, from here, go and just understand your risk and your exposure to that dependency. And I think that's it. That is it.
Sleepwalked into a state where the entire internet, which should be self-healing and open and interoperable, is basically reliant on about a handful of US tech companies.
A tiny number. In fact, we saw 2 incidents last year where two American companies broke for a day each and took out. Took out most of them.
Took down the whole internet.
Yeah. Good question.
Can I ask about mass intelligence gathering by the US?
You can ask. I'm not sure.
I mean, this has been going on for a very long time. And wouldn't that right in thinking it also includes European countries and British companies and so on? And would I be also right in thinking and the information is released to American companies for their usage?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that really worrying? Because it gives the American companies the ability to steal all sorts of intellectual property from British companies.
Yeah, and I mean, in the past, we would have said we had Five Eyes and a number of the other relationships that we had, and so we all respect each other. And I think the big question here has become what's in it for them. We're seeing very much the decisions have been made by the US administration as to what's in it for me, what can I get out of this, and where rules of law, and I think Mark Carney spoke about this extremely well, that before we expected things to be dealt with by the rule of law, and now this is really about spheres of influence. And we, unfortunately, do not have a big enough sphere of influence. And I really do think Mark Carney's position on this was absolutely the right one for us to be taking from this, which is we need the mid-sized countries to be working together on building software, because it's not really going out and finding the smallest nation states. We need to go out and find other people and build relationships. And that's sort of what I was doing with that Eurovision Plus. There are a number of, because you could include as well, quite easily, and I didn't do it, you can include South Africa and Japan and Korea, like there's a much broader spread where we could be building very strong competitors, but because of the fragmented nature, we're going to have to deal with it in a different way. So there is a bit of Conway's law in there, but the US will be designed by a single monoculture and a single sort of design system. We will have to design to a federation.
Want to do something that made fairly early on about the data sharing between particularly with Google and like. I think with the current state that it was the case, but with sovereign capabilities within those companies, they are now fully wholly owned within each sovereign state. So you have much greater fencing. That particular problem is no longer as much as prevalent with the assumption that you are using GovCloud and moving it up. And when you're talking about the alternatives out there, there would also be things like highlighting your Norwegian Plus. There are states in there that may look like they're producing quite good software, but are not necessarily considered staff friendly on a state level.
Yeah.
So while competition is very healthy, maybe it's better the devil you know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
Could you summarise that briefly first, you might, because that was in the account.
yeah, sure. So there's a reference there to one of the comments I made earlier about this is specifically about the FISA and the Cloud Act, where the US government can compel companies to release information. And that assertion is that has been tightened up by having wholly owned businesses. And I think this is true of Swiss Cloud, the GCP, actually is a good example where it is locked up as within the walls of that company, and so can't be compelled to release that information. And there's an extension to that as well, that some of the alternatives that are on that list may not be as capable or produce software that is even as trustworthy as the American providers. So you could be opening yourselves up to different issues by choosing one of those. Is that a reasonable summary? And I think that's totally realistic. I mean, for me, would I choose to move off Amazon today? No, I wouldn't. Would I be scrutinizing every report that came out? And in a lot of situations, that's because I don't, now, a lot of the places that I work at, the information isn't really valuable enough because I generally work as a consultant. If I was working the Financial Times, I might, if I went back there and I was thinking, where am I putting my information? Do I need to put it on the sovereign cloud? And that's why Civio was created for that creation of that kind of UK sovereign cloud. So we are going to see a lot of movement. We're going to see a lot of migration, and there is no doubt we're going to see it from the people with the most money. They are not going to want to lose European and British and Swiss money. They're going to plough that in, and they'll come up with brilliant money. So I think an alternative, it's still American businesses, but American businesses doing slightly different. You've been waiting for a while.
With a sort of a comment to what you just said, is that you're only going to get credible movement from American businesses in that direction if they feel the threat of people actually leaving the site.
Absolutely right. I think competition is a great thing. Coming up with good competitors, not slightly dodgy competitors, is obviously the name of the game. I think if you look at AWS's market share, I don't feel like that's healthy. If you look at the state of the S&P 500, the lack of competition, the monopolies that exist now and are being tolerated existing, I think is a problem. I think that's a bigger problem than just the Cloud Act and FISA allowing access to data.
I just want to follow up question, but I realise I'm waiting as well.
Yeah, so my question is about Azure and
Yeah.
they have their advantages and disadvantages, but what are the disadvantages in terms of security, cyber security I'm thinking of? Not so much you talked about information sharing, but in terms of cyber security, because there's so much dependence. It's a bit like I think it's a bit like when we've got a particular product and we're completely devoted to this process. And you're thinking, it's all going to be fine.
Yeah.
And I'm going to use this project and I'm going to be very safe. And I'm just wondering if there are any downpoints.
Well, there are. In fact, the only time I've ever been heckled speaking to a technical audience was when I saw it years ago at the cybersecurity conference, and I was saying, just use the clouds, use the cloud providers, because they are going to be more secure than at that point I had a data center. Right, my data center is run by people that I know can walk in and turn the server on and off. We make mistakes. We're just human. Their security is levels above. And the heckling started by the gentleman wearing the tinfoil hat at the back and saying, "Yes, but nation states are going to hack them." I think that's the most obvious thing. That's exactly what happened with Microsoft. As soon as you are big, you are going to become a much bigger target. Now that's Wade, because hopefully they will be significantly better at security. But obscurity is a type of defense as well. It's not a great one, but it is a type of defense. So I think that's the biggest weakness. Other than that, like picking any of the three major clouds, this is one of the, like, this is a real day job question for me. Because I walk into businesses and I'm like, all right, you're using AWS, or you're using Zoom. I don't care anymore. Just use whatever. As long as it's one of those three, I don't care. If somebody said I was using OVH, they'd be like, oh, okay. Why are you doing that? Or even Civio. It's like, okay, so you're building a lot of Kubernetes things and you're doing a lot of stuff that you have to manage internally. Why are you doing something that? Whereas the benefit of those three is broadly equivalent in as far as they are very well put together and developers love them because they've hidden away a lot of the complexity of working on the tin itself, the hardware. So the positive side is they're much faster and not necessarily cheaper, but they are cheaper by virtue of being more familiar to the people that are using them. So there's a big benefit of using AWS in particular. Azure is also very popular because there's a flow through because most people use Office 365 and then inherit a lot of their security posture from using 365. Google's in a slightly weird position and it cannot get out of that third place. It is throwing everything it can to come to trying to get out of third place, but it hasn't budged that in years. So there are some downsides, and being able to move away from them is definitely one of them, because you go to AWS because it's got these AWS primitives that make it much easier to store something in the file system. So it's quicker to do it, but it's much harder to move away from it. So that is definitely a downside, but trying to then extract yourself out of AWS becomes harder, because the attraction is go and use the AWS stuff, not use the more familiar bits of architecture. But it's pros and cons. And to be fair, I will, if somebody came to me today and said, I'm starting a new product, where should I put it? I'd say put it on AWS. Regardless of anything that I've said this evening.
So we do a finance side, particularly around British investment in these areas. What is your take on the idea that maybe we should be looking at France, because as a state, they are very much, they want to build capability, and as a state, we're very much a service state. So we are more likely to find somewhere else than building it here. And with the French desire to have a broad set of capabilities in manufacturing and software and all these other things, should we actually be looking at what the investment pipeline is like in such countries rather than looking here? Because I don't think it's going to change here.
Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, a quick summary down through.
So the question, let me see if I can summarize that one correctly. That one's really, given what we saw about investment in the UK and the different areas, should we look at France as a potential place to either take some of their ideas or even get them to build some of the businesses because of the way that they fund them, because they're trying to build services themselves? Should we use that as a model? I think there's a lot of good stuff in France. They've done a lot in Paris recently, and superstar Paris is a startup ecosystem. And I think a lot of this comes from, we should do more with startups, because they will grow and they will fail. But a lot of the ideas, I don't think anybody is going to build the next generation Excel. I think somebody's going to come up with something which is the thing that can run for Excel. And that could be anywhere. We have to make sure they don't leave. That's the big thing. Unfortunately, France as an ecosystem is very France-centric. And what tends to happen in France is if investment goes in, like the first checks and the early series rounds go in, it stays within the French markets and it doesn't really ever escalate out of it. And the French are quite particular about things like their language and their acceptance of, their tolerance of multilingual. I think if you look at the UK ecosystem, it is the best outside. So London is probably the third largest startup city in the world after, I think it beats Boston now. So I think it is LA, sorry, not LA, San Francisco, New York, London, Boston. So we are bigger than the capitals in the UK, in Europe that you would think. So particularly Stockholm, Paris, and Berlin don't really compete with London. So we actually already have a much healthier VC ecosystem. We have more active VCs with better transatlantic relationships. And there's a lot of to and fro from the US. it's just not, it's still not enough. And part of that is not specifically the VCs, but I think the thing that we really could do, and Rachel Reeves tried to do this, I think it's probably a little bit clumsy. We don't get enough large organizations investing back into British businesses. So we've kind of seen the British Business Bank, but we've seen a number of the larger, like the pension fund in the US and things like the university plowing money into VC firms as a percentage of their portfolio. We don't really see that same amount of institutional funding going into VCs in the UK. But that said, I do think there are things we can learn from Paris for sure. Please.
Yeah, thank you. At the heart of all these discussions today is the opportunity in American politics, exactly, which is kind of regulate all this conversation. Here we are talking about switching over technology to some other sovereign state. And my question will be, don't you think, is it not possible that someday we could have the same political volatility in that country? You know what I mean? So my question would be, shouldn't the conversation be more or less on how to control those mega US companies to kind of hold them to bear, get them to kind of restrict our data, not to say or find a way to control them rather than reaching over to another thing. We are giving an example of France today. We might have a new French president and we might be caught if we are we kind of push it again to be switched over to someone else. So my view would be we would be talking about control rather than switching.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and that's why I would definitely make the point. So I will repeat that question. Really, the heart of that is we know the American devil. Is it not better knowing that devil? So we had that relationship. There is a short-term issue that has come to light under the current US administration. The US administrations, fortunately, currently are time limited. And so it will come to an end, and isn't this a bit of a fuss about nothing? Couldn't we be in a worse position? Couldn't we be in a worse position with if we moved to, say, France as an example, and France had a different style of leadership, that could be worse for us. So I think that represents your question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. And part of this is a monopoly problem, and the fact that the way that the US economy is structured is effectively allowing oligarchy, a tech oligarchy, to creep up in American society. So there isn't a healthy sort of distribution of competition in the US ecosystem. What's really happened here, like this, we've called out the heart of it. We're responding because something looks serious. It's been getting serious for a very long period of time. The US administration didn't cause this problem. Microsoft and Google absolutely dominating tech ecosystems is the problem in AWS. That's the problem. We are dependent on them because they are better than anybody else. We've made that choice, but there wasn't sufficient competition regulation. Now, we don't get to control that. The US gets to control that. So the only thing that we can really do, and I think it tallies back to that response that we had just now, is if we at least have some competition. It's not that we're going to create anything better, but at least we can have the pressure of realistic competition, so that some of those figures look like Google 10%, Azure 12%, AWS 15%. That looks like a much healthier spread of those suppliers across the market. The other massive problem that we have goes back to silicon, which is we're even more dependent on the tiny number of companies for the CPUs and the GPUs that power all of it. And there isn't any good competition. I think it's exactly the right point. I think it's fundamental. But that's why I would say don't change now, just be aware of the risk and the threat and the dependency that you have. Are we going to time?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Can I ask you to reiterate why you think that the hardware problem, chip production question, why it is so insoluble?
Why it's insoluble? Well, almost all chip production at the moment, certainly for the GPUs, is being done into the WAN at the moment.
Yeah.
And that could be, and I think we were just talking about this earlier, Brian, that it's there is definitely this kind of butterfly effect thing over concentration, like chip manufacturer. I've read a number of articles about what, and actually spoken to people that are in silicon, so they outsource silicon fabrication. And a lot of the things that have been said is it would be impossible for any other country to try and replicate what is being done in China or Taiwan today, because the processes and the training of the individuals doesn't exist. So we can't replicate it, not because we can't get the machines or don't have the machines, but we haven't trained the people.
It's also massively expensive, you know, great to achieve.
I've got a couple of online questions that have been waiting
Of course, yeah.
very patiently.
Yes.
Quite a while. And thank you to those online who have been helping us with the audio throughout the evening as well. First question from Mark. Fantastic presentation. Thank you. What about software infrastructure, especially DNS, which is wholly USA based?
I almost want I would, if they were in the room, I would ask them to explain that a little bit more. I mean, DNS is one of the things that actually is pretty resilient, but it is highly concentrated in a small number of providers. So that might be where that's kind of where I'm thinking. So DNS, like the internet is one of the great creations, one of humankind's greatest creations, and it was built to be incredibly fault tolerant. And DNS is still one of the things that is almost unattainable as long as you don't concentrate it in too few companies. So we've got a monopoly problem, not because there is a problem with DNS or the architecture of DNS itself, which is really very solid and very well proven. But if everybody hosts their DNS on Cloudflare and Cloudflare breaks, we have a problem. That's a Cloudflare problem or an AWS problem, and so a DNS problem. There are a lot of issues that are like that, and a lot of the protocols that we have. Look at email. It's a protocol that was designed without passwords or any security at all in its earliest iterations, and it's still here and still powering things. So we do have a lot of creaking protocols under the hood.
I've got one more online, which you may get into interpret. Another strand. What about open source development tools or European Linux distros? And even though it doesn't say it's in the question, I'm minded of things like WordPress incidents that happen.
Is that in terms of risk or using them? Do you get a sense of? If it's using them, knock yourself out. I mean, by choice, my servers will be running some version of Linux rather than some version of Windows. I actually wrote some of the slides that you saw this evening on an Ubuntu desktop using OpenOffice. So, I will at a push use open source software. I've listed out a number of those tools which are open source, genuinely fantastic open source tools. And the beauty of open source is it's very difficult to pull out the threads, like where is the board of that open source consortium. And so there is quite a lot of invisibility of non-USA Linux distros, etc. Invisibility? Well, yeah, I mean, Ubuntu has done a fantastic job of making itself visible for sure. I mean, I was looking at one of the things I was looking at earlier was EOS, which is, although it's not specifically Linux related, EOS is the Google version of Android. So it works both in the laptop, so the desktop ecosystem, and the mobile ecosystem. We do need more visible Linux distros. I mean, back in the day, it used to be Red Hat for servers. And probably something like Gentoo or KDE, I don't. But obviously, what's in recently is Ubuntu are absolutely dominant. That said, it's Debian under the hood, and so there are a lot of other Debian, like if you pick up a Raspberry Pi, it's Debian under the hood as well. So yes, it's invisible, but it's invisible because for most people it's boring. Most people aren't interested. Most people want Mac, unfortunately, and they want that tight coupling of the hardware and the software. And Linux is still too technical for things are in the wrong place. I mean, even something like a Chromebook is too hard for most people.
I think one of the things that will begin to be developed to make people talk about that is have more UX experience and research as well.
Yeah.
Because that's where, I mean, Apple seems to be going down a strange route at the minute.
Yeah.
But that's why Apple did so well, put a lot of money into UX design and research.
100%, and Microsoft does as well. I still think comparing, especially now after the weird glassy release in Mac OS, I still think that Microsoft actually does a fantastic job, apart from trying to put ads and upselling Microsoft everywhere. But their user experience has come on leaps and bounds. Windows 10 and 11, I thought were actually really high quality interfaces. But it is very much horses for courses. So yes, it would be nice to see more Linux distributions competing with Ubuntu. It would be nice to have more choice in the market, but they have to be good enough. Like they have to stand on their own.
It's sort of the interesting thing is that from sort of like more the entertainment tables, Linux is actually well run ahead because that's what happens with Steam Deck.
Yeah.
And Steam are very much wanting to make every game that's released from a PC work on a Steam Deck.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. They'll be taking place in Mac Minis because all the Mac Minis sold out after OpenClaw made the recommendation to use them. So it'll be Steam Decks next. How are we doing?
It's probably coming towards
Towards the end.
we should wrap up. That's been a fascinating.
Thank you all very much for bearing with me.
Yeah, no, that's been great. Just perhaps a final question. Would it help if we had sort of open protocol so that you didn't have Excel working one way and LibreOffice working another? But I guess the difficulty would be get that situation.
I think open protocols would be fantastic. There is a rabbit hole I didn't go down here, but I would strongly recommend, if you get the opportunity, go and read Cory Doctorow if you haven't heard them before. He writes a lot about open source and about this kind of control in the US government. One of the things he talks about is the way that the previous US administrations have controlled our European rights through to sort of backwards reverse engineer intellectual property. And that's even for things in printer cartridges. So if you wonder why we still have to buy Packard printer cartridges, there are now relatively ancient, sort of decades old, or at least decade old agreements that were signed between Europe and the UK and the US that forbids us from tampering with John Deere tractors or going and taking apart HP cartridges. And it's because there are no open protocols, and it's because that right to reverse engineer has been removed from us as a SOC to the US administration. So I can't even possibly go into it, but go and read Cory Doctorow. He does a fantastic job of telling that story.